handle?
I think it is partially systemic. I was smiling because I was thinking about the history of white people in America, not the actual thing. There had been a show called The History of White People in America with Martin Mull and Fred Willard, the late Fred Willard. And at one point, Fred Willard is having a nervous breakdown at work. He's stressed and he's burnt out. And his boss, as played by Martin Mull, comes to him and says, listen, I can tell things are really tough for you here. I think you need to take some time off, you know? He's like, oh, God, thank God, that's really what I need to hear. Mull has a perfect comedic timing, pauses for a beat, and goes, you also need to work harder. So a lot of times when you say it's systemic or process-based, you have these conflicting narratives that you're supposed to engage and entertain at the same time. You know, like everybody, they had to force at Google, for example, you can only accrue, I think, some crazy high number of vacation days. But the reality of it is Google makes it so easy sometimes for people to be there that many of them skip by and then have to be forced to take their vacation. And even that, in Germany, they have the right to be left alone. A lot of Europe, they have the right to be left alone, but people still want to be part of the flow. So they take these forced vacations, and then they're checking their email and they're attending meetings on the forced vacations. So it's a really weird, horrible cycle of everybody feeling miserable about things that they're doing to themselves. And as a boss, you know, you're stuck because you actually want the work done, but you don't want it to be done by people who are zombies, right? That's not an effective use of your human resource. So I'd be interested to hear what you think burnout looks like from a management perspective. Like, how can you tell outside of people just leaving, which is a crucial response? How can you tell when you're burned out or the people working for you are burned out?
I mean, one of the first things that I notice is a change in people's ability to emotionally regulate themselves, right? So like one of the things that I noticed, I had, my book launched a month ago, and then I went into this very demanding project for my day job. I mean, a project that I liked, but it was very demanding. I was working, I had to fly out of town and lead this kind of, intensive 2-day session. And so what I noticed is that my ability to regulate my emotions diminished the more fatigued I got, right? So I found myself, reacting with anger to something that was not even mildly irritating, right? Feeling, having an inability to maintain my perspective, what is actually important. And so if you have people that work for you that have traditionally been fairly even keeled, able to control their emotions, showing up with a professional affect, able to kind of make in the moment decisions about what's important, what's not important. And suddenly they can't do any of those things, right? If they are suddenly flying off the handle or paralyzed with indecision or unable to do tasks that they used to be able to do easily, that can be a sign that they are actually burnt out, right? That they are just... that they're too tired when they've lost that sort of perspective. I think another clue can be if you are dealing with someone who is creative, and I mean that very widely, right? Like not necessarily a copywriter, but a developer, someone who's a strategic thinker, and suddenly they got nothing, right? Like the well is dry. Both of those can be signs that someone is actually approaching burnout.
Okay, now suppose I am a boss of a place that chops lumber, and I have an employee who has hurt their arm from chopping the lumber. Obviously, given the laws now they exist in America, I need to help this person. I need to pay for their health care. I need to nurse them back to health and make them fully able to do their job again. But now I have an employee that also doesn't have an arm problem. Is still chopping the same amount of lumber, comes into work, smile on their face. Does it make sense I guess legally, can I reward the one over the other? And then how much is too much in terms of dispensation for the person who's hurt their arm and can't chop the lumber?
And so are you making an analogy that someone who has become burnout at work, it's almost like a labor and industries work sustained injury?
I'm sort of making the point. Yeah, kind of. It's not like workman's comp. Not if I slip off of a ladder and hurt my leg there, but it is clear that you're not able to do the job. And, management has very narrow objectives. I got to have that wood chopped. I don't care who chops it. I got to have that wood chopped. I've known people who were on the on the kind of left side of making this what we used to call in professional wrestling a work. When they started hating the job, they started leaning on easily accessible, burnout indicators to get time off from the work that they hated, rather than addressing it and going, I really don't like this job and I want to change. And in fact, the guy who did this for years finally had a manager at Google, weirdly enough, again, who, when he came back from 8 months on disability because he was burnt out, said to him, what do you want to do? And he goes, well, no, I need to get back to my desk and catch it. No. In a perfect world, what do you want to do? And I don't want to give away his job too much, but he had been doing something that was not part of his job task at Google, just accidentally, and decided and figured out that he really loved that. And they said, great, why don't you do that? They gave him $50,000 to put it together and moved him to YouTube, which is ideally where he wanted to be, also owned by Google. So it was a good fix. You could put somebody in the job who really wanted to do the job and wasn't likely to get burned out, and you can move the burned out guy into a place where he was going to enjoy the job. That was luck, though. Usually nobody's that lucky, and certainly not in the field that you and I have spent time in, media, editorial, and journalism.
Right.
That's not the way that works. So I'm trying to figure out from both sides how you best serve the employee and the manager.
I think what I'm considering is that if you are in a leadership position and you have, any kind of team that works for you, burnout is a problem, right? If somebody who works for you at the lumber chopping store continues to get injured every single time, then you need to look at your processes around chopping that lumber, right? If this keeps happening over and over again, maybe it's not the individual, maybe he wasn't a klutz. And maybe we don't think better of the person who has yet to injure their arm than blaming the person who injures their arm, right? I mean, if somebody keeps getting cut and going to the hospital because there's no guard over the saw, then the problem is the guard over the saw, which you as the employer should be providing. And that's the circumstance that I'm talking about, is that so often the burnout is coming from things that could be changed, but it doesn't work with shareholder value, right? Like, why would you have 5 people to do a job well when you can only afford 3 and just expect the other 3 to just be working harder? I think also recognizing that we don't know what people are carrying outside of work, right? So like one of the things that we have to recognize is that in burnout, it's not just the daily chores you have to do at your work and the tasks that you're responsible for. It's also kind of the allostatic load that you're carrying, right? Like, what does your brain have to deal with every day? Put aside, I mean, people will have whatever they have going on at home, which you don't necessarily know, but just right now, living in the world for most people without, who are not straight, cis, white, Christian, able-bodied men under 50, which is most of us, there is probably some trepidation, right? There are things that are changing. So if you're talking about the lumber store, I live in Washington State. ICE is making raids on Home Depot, and you could understand in a circumstance where someone is at threat, right? Their livelihood, they're afraid that they or somebody in their family is going to be snatched up by masked men who don't feel like they need to provide any sort of identification. That is going to impact someone's allostatic load, right? And so I think it's just being aware.
What is the word you just used there? I didn't hear.
So allostatic load is the idea of like, what are you carrying emotionally, psychologically, intellectually, right? So someone who is working a demanding job has a certain allostatic load. Someone who is working a demanding job after their wife just asked for a divorce and their father just dropped dead of a heart attack is carrying a different allostatic load, right? And so it's kind of like, what are the things that you're bearing? And a lot of times, again, to go back to this idea, if we are looking at people who are burnt out as having a personal failure or an inability to adjust, then we are not considering the fact that there are other things that are impacting any one person's being burnt out. I mean, that's why large corporations have, employee assistance programs, because there's an acknowledgement that if your father just died or if you're going through a divorce, you may need some help. So let's give you access to a lawyer or a therapist.
Or like when I was leading a breakout session at a company where we both spent time, Ozzy, and one of the people, we were doing an offsite, and one of the people had announced that her grandmother had died, and the response from management was, "Send flowers, we expect you there." And she did. She forewent the attending the funeral of her grandmother, and proceeded to go to the offsite and sit in my breakout session and sob about having missed her grandmother's funeral. But there was no employee. There was an employee assistance program, but you were certainly not encouraged to take it or use it or to spend any time doing these things. So this is when you talk about it being systemic or process based. That's kind of what my mind turns to.
Yeah, this is a show called The Bad Boss Brief, and that is bad boss behavior. So let's just talk a little bit about, if you are an individual who is experiencing burnout, as both of us seem to be right now, what are some things that you can do? Well, the first thing is to recognize that your perspective, your judgment may be not at its best. And so you want to make sure you have a trusted friend, sounding board person, right? And this doesn't have to be something formal like an executive coach or a therapist. It could be your wise aunt or your sister, but somebody that you can run things by. And a couple of things that I suggest to my executive coaching clients that are struggling with burnout is do a very, very light audit. Like, this is something you could write on the back of a napkin or in your notes app, and look at how are you spending your time over a day or a couple of days or a week. And look at these things. One, is there anything that you are doing that you don't need to do? Either because it's not in your job description, or you are over functioning for someone else. So let's say you're a mid-level manager and there's someone on your team who consistently underperforms on a particular task. And you get into the bad habit of saying, okay, I'll just do that task. I'll just take that, right? Because it's faster for me to just do it myself.
Correct.
Right. Which is never a good plan. But this is a good time for you to look and be like, is there anything I'm doing regularly that I don't need to do? Are there any meetings we really don't need? Do we have to have this all staff meeting every week, or could we do it once a month? So take things off your plate that don't need to be there. And then I think also look in at the personal realm. So if you live with another person, is that person pulling their weight?
Yes. Okay.
And I think it's a good thing to ask. And I mean, I've talked before about Pew studies that show that in opposite sex relationships, women carry the lion's share of the chores and the childcare and the sort of managing of the house. And every time you give me that face, I recognize that as a statistic, a generalization. Right. It does not happen in my house. It does not happen in your house. But I'm just saying, for many people, that's true. But that even happens with kids. Like, people are surprised to hear that, I was a single mom. My kids were doing the dishes as soon as they could reach the sink. They did their own laundry. They did the yard work. They cooked meals from when they were.
Everybody's got to help out.
The other thing is, are you able to focus on what is important? People talk about getting sucked into something that feels urgent, but isn't actually critical in the longer term. And if you do an audit, if you start to look intentionally at, how am I spending my time? Are these things that I'm going to look back in 3 months or 6 months and recognize were important to my career, my job, the organization as a whole? Then, maybe you need to shift some of how those things are working.
In kind of taking your cue there, kind of what I hate sports analogies, mostly because I know nothing about sports outside of MMA, boxing, combat sports. But I always look at it like like a baseball thing. Like, I don't have to hit a home run. I don't have to do anything except get the ball somewhere out in the field. I could bunt it. I could hit a single. These are things I know. I could hit a double. I mean, those are usually after you hit the ball that you run around the bases, so you can you clear space for you to do these things. And so what I tend to do is to compartmentalize, so that all I have to do is the next thing in front of me, which works until somebody in a professional situation, you hear a lot, well, what about the 12th thing? And you're like, yeah, I can't really think about the 12th thing right now. I can think about 1, 2, and 3. That's about it. So I think, what is that line from Magnum Force about being able to recognize your limitations? I find that personally helpful. And that's what you're suggesting, just to kind of reduce, winnow away and deal with what's immediately in front of you. Maybe because we're both in positions where, at this point, if we suffer from burnout, the only person who's really affected is us. So, I mean, you got to keep working that book. Yeah.
Right.
Nobody's playing Buñuel shows if I don't play the Buñuel shows.
Right.
So it's got to happen. Right. So,
but you bring up a good point, which is one of the challenges that I see with burnout is there are organizational cultural dynamics that really focus on the drama. Right. So if, there are lots of bosses that come in with their hair on fire. Oh my gosh, we have to do this, that, or the next thing. And, there's that line of like, your inability to plan is not my emergency. But when you have a boss or a supervisor or an organization that has a lot of drama where everything is spun up, like I used to do, new business at ad agencies. And there was a horrible CEO who and worked for, who was always like, this is a pitch winning idea. We have to change everything from blue to green the night before the pitch. And it's like, no, actually you don't. People will use that drama for various reasons. It can be a power play. It can be just straight up abuse. But recognizing that if you are in a system where there is this hyper intensity of emotion and a lot of drama, that can make it really hard for you to set and maintain appropriate priorities and act on them.
Yep. Well, and when I've been in situations like that, when I've been unfortunate enough to have bosses like that, I go for the darkest of all those options. I think they were addicted to the drama. And this, like when I was at Code Magazine, which was a magazine, it was a men's fashion magazine. So it took its lead from the fashion industry where everything was a dramatic, emergency. And I just tried to, as soon as the people from Condé Nast shipped out and I, and got some magazine folks in there, I tried to change the whole culture. It's like, the panic, the fire drill thing, we can't. It's counterproductive for us.
Right.
I need everybody here relaxed and churning out their best, highest quality material, and that's kind of what I said about doing. But it's very heady. It's it's in the same way that I can kind of understand drug addiction. It's all very heady and exciting, but in the long term, it just doesn't pay, kids. So,
right. And then you are at much greater likelihood of people getting burned out and not being able to work effectively. And then the last thing is, if you are in a situation where you're consistently burned out, really look at your options. And again, realize when we are exhausted and burnt out, we are not as creative. We cannot see as many options. And this is where you might really need a trusted friend. But look at, if you think you can't leave this job, you may need to step back and figure out why you think you can't leave this job. So what are your options for changing your circumstances in some way? And a lot of times when we're burnt out, we don't have the emotional bandwidth to look at what our other options are. And this is where I will suggest in my book, The Saint and the Drunk, A Guide to Making the Big Decisions in Your Life. The middle section of the book takes 9 cultural narratives that I consistently see in working with clients. And it just invites you to look at the stories you carry. So for example, there's a section about quitting. Who gets to leave a job and when is that called quitting, right? Because quitting is generally pejorative. And if you can just stop and take a minute to understand, are there stories that I was told by my culture, by my family, that I am going to be a failure if I X, right? That, like, we've talked about this a lot of times. There used to be a story of you have to stay at a job for 2 years. Otherwise, people are going to think you're a wastrel job hopper, right? That's not really true anymore. But, why would you do that? So I think the idea of making some space, and again, I recognized if you're burnout, you don't have space, but trying to just take a little bit of bandwidth and sit down with someone who you trust and be like, is there anything I'm missing?
Right.
Do you think that's Pollyanna-ish, or do you think that it is possible?
No, I think that works. I remember there's a kid who I went to elementary school, Todd Skier, and he's bounced back quite nicely from this. Was running a casino in Las Vegas last I heard, but we went to this very kind of progressive kind of, it was run by East Indians, but it was in the Montessori system, very progressive kind of elementary school. And the teacher would give him some work, and he'd be slow about the work. And then they would go on to the next lesson and give him put another book on top of his desk. And then all of the rest of us would be waiting because we knew what was happening. We could see his face get red. He was getting upset. And then, he'd still be working on the first one when the second one was there. And then they would put a third one. And then, of course, we greeted this moment with great glee, because then Todd would inevitably flip out the first time he did it. We greeted it with shock and then eventually, uncomfortable laughter. But then it became like a thing. He grabbed all of his books, threw them up to the sky, and stalk out, slamming the door behind him, and they called his parents and they talked to him about it. But this was his response to the high stress. And I thought, though it was amusing to me and the others, what it seemed to me mostly is that Todd was having an unpleasant educational experience. And it just did. I mean, I was glad that it was amusing me, but I couldn't imagine being him and wanting to come to school every day if I could never get ahead, no matter what I did. And I had no sympathetic the adults, they knew what there was no dispensation made for him taking longer. So it was a kind of a curious rondelay. And then I remember earlier, one of the parents of one of my classmates was a psychiatrist. And I don't know, in this day and age, you couldn't pull this off. He said, "I'd like to meet with all the students." I don't remember anybody asking my parents. I must have been about 6 years old. And they put a puzzle in front of me. And it was a puzzle of a Volkswagen Beetle with a dog in the back or something. And he put it on the table upside down, took out a stopwatch and said, "Put it together. Finish the puzzle." And as I'm finishing the puzzle, he's screaming at me, just like screaming, throwing stuff, distracting, doing everything he possibly can to make this difficult. And I remember thinking in my head, his son, my classmate, Glenn, is nuts. His father is nuts. And I just blocked him out to finish. This was my response to stress. But, these things in a modern workplace, when you're 35 and you've got a husband or wife at home, a partner at home, and you've got kids and you've got car payments and bills and health insurance, health issues, parents that need to be taken care of. I'd like to see a situation where we're a lot more understanding than it seems like we are.
Right. Well, and to get to
these people aren't happy fundamentally. They're not. Nobody wants to be that way, right?
And that some of these could be adjusted with simple accommodations. I mean, I don't know that an IEP, an individual education plan, or whatever those letters stand for, I don't remember them being around when we were kids. But the idea now, your friend would have gotten an accommodation and the teachers would have worked with him. This is not going to happen generally and systemically, but a good boss will try to work with reasonable accommodations to allow people to work effectively, right? Because if you have a good employee and they have skills, then why not work with them to maximize their ability to do, because you're going to do good work when you don't feel like throwing your metaphorical school books up in the air.
In the air.
Exactly. All right. Well, that's what we've got time for. Thank you for joining us on the road in Florida.
No, North Carolina now.
Oh, North Carolina. Sorry. Somewhere south. Yeah. It's all kind of
first in flight. First in flight. Okay, great. Yeah. And we will see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everybody. Bye. Adios.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of the Bad Boss Brief podcast with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's number 3, on Instagram. Reach out with your questions, concerns, work case situations, or suggestions to us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. We personally answer every submission. Be sure to join us at badbossbrief.substack.com every other Wednesday for episodes of Bad Boss Brief so you can gain further insights into your workplace environments. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.